Today, I'm going to talk about a legend. He is famous for inventing and beating world-class players like Bobby Fischer and Michal Tal with move 1G3. Also, he's famous for popularizing his gambit. He's also very much known for his endgame prowess, and he was 8 times US champion. Yeah? Pal Benko, yes. So Benko Pal, who will become 90 in July. So in honor of that, this lecture is dedicated to Benko Pal, who was born in Amiens, France, also a Hungarian American Grandmaster, very famous for the opening, the Benko variation, the Benko Gambit, and the Benko opening is 1G3. And that's how he beat Tal and Fischer. Now, this lecture would be fairly incomplete without starting with his most famous opening, the Benko. He actually told a story about this, that he found this idea interesting and felt that, okay, it deserves a try. But the more he tried it, the more success he had with it. And he just picked it up from there, and he also wrote a book about it. A6, this is the classical Benko. B takes, bishop takes A6, D6, knight F3, G6, G3, bishop G7. So in general, in these Benko type of positions, black will try to use the fact that he has open lines and files that white doesn't have. So this rook is inferior to this already activated rook on A8. We'll see how Benko uses the power of his rooks and positions. Knight D7, rook E1. And now he plays queen B6, E4. But E4 invites a very nice maneuver that obviously Benko chooses immediately. How should Benko play in this position? Yes, knight G4. As Benko is eyeing the square on D3, and that is a very bad sign for white. I'm not sure he was conscious about that, but anyways, that knight is headed there. Queen C2, rook B8. No, you're not going to move your bishop from C1. You're going to be stuck there forever. And that's actually the rut that white can get into if unfamiliar with this system. H3, Benko says, thank you so much, knight E5. Knight takes E5, B3, but then it's too late because knight D3 jump comes. And it's kind of an aesthetic view of seeing that everything is hanging for white right now. Rook D1, C4, just opening up the whole position. Bishop E3, queen B4, bishop D2, queen C5. So white has quite a few problems here. He has trouble developing and also struggling in general. C takes, A takes, knight B4, queen B2, rook C8. Now, black's position is so good that he's not even willing to take on F1. In fact, he plays rook C8 first, just emphasizing the fact that this knight on C3 is in kind of a pickle. Queen A3, bishop takes C3. Now that was an offer he couldn't refuse. Takes, rook C1, queen D4. And bishop F1. Obviously, it's over by now, but he plays rook C2, which is very stylish. Mate is coming, and also if you take, I'll take you, and I'll double attack you at the same time. Now, he played plenty of other games with this opening, but I felt that this was one of the best highlights of how active or how well you can play this type of positions. Yes, you had a question. So this is the first game I wanted to show, and want to continue with two other games which shows Benko Pal's style of play. G3, we can see the fur reminiscence of 1 G3, which we will see in the game he played against Fischer. So C4, C5, G3, this is the classical English opening. And actually, what's exciting about this matchup, as he's playing Averbakh, is two endgame masters are pitted against each other. So we will see who is the ultimate endgame player in this game. Bishop G2, Bishop G7, Knight C3, Knight C6, D3. All very symmetrical. Even the computer says it's ultra-symmetrical. I wouldn't go that far. Knight F3, E5. But Averbakh wants to have this Botvinnik kind of structure. A3. But Benko does his usual plan of preparing the idea of A3, B4. A6, castle, Knight E7, Knight E1. Preparing this long strategic plan of Knight C2, Knight E3, Knight D5, combined with the potential idea of Rook B1 and B4. Rook B8, Knight C2, B5, B4. So Benko decides to go for B4 instead of trying to occupy the D5 square. Now, if you're asking if there's some ideas of E4, well, obviously, White always has to deal with this idea. But let's say I can move my bishop, but at some moments this sacrifice isn't too bad, as the dark squares will be awfully weak after I bring my bishop to B2. So I'd say that Benko has very good compensation in this type of position. So Averbakh sees no reason to enter that position. C takes B4, Knight takes castles, takes, Rook A5. So there's some minor differences between the two positions. Can we spot the differences between White's position and Black's position?
Pawn on E5 is blocking its own bishop.
Yeah, this pawn on E5 is blocking the G7 bishop. And also, Black has these weaknesses on B5 and D6.
White is just faster.
Yeah, White is just faster. And Benko is putting heavy pressure on that B5 pawn. Bishop D7, not that Averbakh can't defend at this moment. Bishop G5, again probing a little bit for more weaknesses. And he gets that. Bishop takes C7, Queen takes C7. And now, this is an interesting decision. Benko decides to get rid of the knight, as he feels that this knight will be much stronger in the long run than any of those bishops. Queen B3, just bolstering that D5 square. Rook F8, Bishop D5, Bishop E8, Knight E4. And now White has a very nice blockade on the white squares. Also a battery, which is kind of annoying for Black right now. King H8, Rook A6, Rook D8, Bishop C6. So now it's clear that Benko used all these moves to get rid of this dangerous bishop on E8. It's dangerous because it can get active in the long run, and it also has a function of defending these pawns. But he plays Bishop C6, hoping to get an amazing endgame where he has this amazing E4 knight against that terrible bishop on G7. Takes, D5. And D5 was a good move. Averbakh is trying to do something before it's too late. Because after F5, White could play Knight C3, and positionally, this position would be just terrible. Could even be considered strategically winning for White. So D5 is played, but then Benko plays the knight on C5, E4, And here, Benko comes up with a very nice positional move that stabilizes the situation in the center. How did Benko proceed here? E3, yes. So, in general, Benko prefers to have the position closed as he has a knight. And also, if the position closes up again, this bishop will feel the same misery as when it was watching the e5 pawn. So e takes d3, queen takes d3. This is a logical decision by Yuri Averbakh. Obviously, he's not going to play d4, because then I'll just push e4, and after f4, and maybe even e5, white will have a healthy bind. So he plays queen e5, knight a6, knight c5, rook b8, rook d1. Now, this is a method often used by elite and grandmasters to gain some time on the clock. They repeat the position, and also they're kind of asking if their opponent really has any better idea than just following whatever ideas they have in mind. So rook d1, king g8, again, one more repetition, getting closer to time control, and that's kind of the added benefit of repeating. Knight a6 again, but now Benko found the plan of rook c5. And as you'll see in many other games that we will be looking at, Benko is using ideas of having a bind to full effect. He's trying to squeeze the life out of black's position. Queen d6, rook d5. Unfortunately for Averbakh, he's one move late, so he can't capture the a6 knight because the d8 rook is dropping. So he'll have to console himself to have a worse endgame, a pawn down. But let's see how Benko wins this. Bishop f8, knight c5. The job is done, so the knight comes back to c5. Rook a7, knight d3. Now notice that he doesn't want this rook to get awfully active, because the rook wanted to go to a4 or even a2. And we'll try to get active, but Benko is trying to force it to stay passive as he threatens the idea of taking the pawn. Rook a1 check, king g2, rook d1, king f3. Just like in the previous lecture I did, white is trying to gain some time and bring the king as quickly as possible, as that will be the key to win this endgame. Rook d2. Averbakh, as an endgame expert himself, doesn't want to see that king coming any closer. e4, h5, e5. So actually, Averbakh is playing against the idea of king e3, because then there's this check, and black would get some sort of counterplay here. So Benko is in no rush. He gets some more space, e5, and potentially an f6 outpost that could be useful for the knight on d3. h4, Averbakh goes for exchanges, because as we know, if black would manage to exchange off all the pawns and then sacrifice the bishop for the last pawn, that would be a drawn endgame. Obviously, that's a daydream, but you know, if you're trying to defend, you must dream sometimes. G takes h4, rook d1, king e2, rook h1. So it's no wonder that Benko takes the pawn. He doesn't want to get into those endgames. Rook d1, king e2, rook b5, rook h2. So Averbakh is looking for a solution of getting rid of Benko's pawns. Rook b8 takes b5. King g7, b6. So Benko pushes the pawn. Rook h1, but it's not over yet. Because let's say b7, you can go rook b1, and it's not that easy to promote this pawn. And the next thing that Averbakh would start doing is start annoying you and try to exchange off as many pawns as possible with either rook b5 or even potentially f6 after moves like bishop e7. So no wonder Benko plays rook b7, forcing the king to move. Rook b1, f4. Now e6 he doesn't play because of ideas I'm not sure of. I guess maybe king g8. Because if king f6, then rook takes f7 wins, but king g8 could be annoying. Okay, maybe e7. Although, takes, and I'm not saying this is drawish, but this can get complicated sometimes. So he plays f4, just playing it strategically. King d2, bishop a3, king c2. Rook b5, king c3. So you can notice that Benko is methodically trying to improve his position. He knows he's a pawn up, so he feels that he should be winning somehow. And I think that's correct. King c4, rook b1, rook b8, king g5, f takes g5, king g7. And here, even though Benko is known to be a very good classical player, he's also good at other stuff. And here, Benko found an amazing move. So white to move and win. g6, I'll most probably take that pawn. Yeah. Notice that this rook on b1 is the only piece for black that has any chances of stopping that b6 pawn. If we manage to cut this piece off, we might actually find the move that Benko played. King c3? Well, I'll just play bishop e7 and I'm just waiting. Knight b4, then I'll take you. But check, so that, yes. But if you could get rid of that bishop, maybe.
Knight takes f8 and rook takes f8.
Yes. Rook takes f8, king takes, well, black played rook takes b6, but if king takes f8, then knight b4, and miraculously, there's no way of stopping my b pawn, and even if you do, which you will not, I will just push the pawn, and even if you sacrifice it, I'll have just too many materials. You can't win both of the pawns. And this is easily winning. So this is a very neat sacrifice by white. So Averbakh takes the pawn, but this is just lost. Rook g6, rook d7, king d5, king e4. And slowly but surely, Benko is cashing in. b7, king g5, knight d5, just bringing the knight closer. Knight e3, knight f5, knight d6. And just the king comes over. And if the rook moves to f1, I'll just bring my king closer, then sack at the right moment. I'm not even sure if I have to sack. Slowly you'll lose because you don't really have moves. And in fact, here, white is just winning after knight takes f7, as king takes f7 loses to king d7, as this is child's play for the two endgame experts. So Averbakh resigned. Second game I wanted to show was the game he played against Korchnoi. And this game is very interesting in the way Benko slowly uses space to win the game. Takes, bishop d2. And now, this is near equal. White doesn't really have too much advantage here, but just look how Benko makes it look easy. King e7, rook c1, a3. So the main idea is to take away the squares of this knight. so it doesn't feel that comfortable. Rook c8, bishop c4. Knight a5, bishop a2. Now, the main issue in these positions with black is that black doesn't have a constructive plan. The only constructive plan Korchnoi found actually was to start exchanging stuff. Now I think knight c4 is not too great, because bishop takes c4, rook c2, and the fact is that this knight is just going to be much better than this bishop on c4. Bishop a6, rook c1, takes, king d7, e5, and Benko is going to win this endgame. I'm not saying it's necessarily winning, but it's very instructive how Benko plays here. Knight f3. Well, he's probing for some weaknesses, so he's planning to go knight g5. h6, knight d2. Can anybody tell me where white is headed with that knight? Obviously d6. He's going for that d6 square. King d7, knight e4, b6, f4. But first things first, he puts his pawns in a long chain and also on black squares, so that bishop will never hit target. Bishop f1, king d4, bishop g2, knight d6, f5. So Korchnoi is trying to defend most of his pawns and tries to position these pawns as far away as possible from the knight. Knight b5, probing for more weaknesses. And again, Korchnoi has no other choice than to obey and plays bishop c1, a5. a5 is a move I'm not sure is a great one. It's a bit too aggressive. Now this is sometimes the way Korchnoi plays. He's very ambitious, sometimes too ambitious. So maybe, even though I get Korchnoi's idea of trying to stop the idea of b4, b5, a5 could be a little bit too aggressive. But maybe it's still okay. b4, takes. So this still seems defendable, as black only has one weakness and just not enough targets for white to win yet. Bishop a3, knight c4, king c6, knight d6. So Benko is slowly probing for more weaknesses, but after king c6 he realizes, okay, you're going here to b5, annoying my pawn on b4. I'll stop you. I don't want to see you there. King d7, knight c4, knight e3. But Benko is inviting Korchnoi to do something. Also, he's taking away these squares from the bishop. So black played king b5, king c3, g5. But I think g5 is just too much. I do understand it's getting much harder to move with black, because this bishop is stuck suddenly. So most probably, Korchnoi should have played bishop f1, hoping for the best. Because this way, the bishop on h3 just got stuck. g5, knight c4, takes, king c6, king d4. h5, knight d6. But already Benko made progress. This pawn on h5 is clearly weak. h4, knight c8. And now the knight does the backflip and is headed to over knight e7, knight g6. Knight e7, king c3. And now the tough part here for black is that he has no control on dark squares and he can do nothing, just watching how Benko does these knight pirouettes in these positions. h3, knight g8. King c6, knight f6, king d4, king b5, knight d7. But he's not going back anymore, and he's planning to gobble up that b6 pawn. King c3, bishop a2, knight f8, king c6, knight h7. And as the bishop went too far away to a2, the problem will be here on h3. And it's just a tempo too short of saving that pawn there, because then I'll take the e6 pawn then. Bishop, instead of bishop d5, he played king d5, knight f6, king d4, king b5, king c3, knight h7, and slowly, Benko is outplaying Korchnoi. Bishop c4, king e3, king f2, king g3, and now Benko is about to pick up this important pawn, so Korchnoi must do some action on the other side. But then Benko takes that other pawn, which is more important because this will be a true runner and will do the home run for Pal. So knight takes e6, king takes b4, knight d4, and the problems are twofold for Korchnoi. This pawn will start running while this f5 pawn will also be in danger. Knight takes f5, b4, knight e3, knight takes h2, takes b3. And the problem is that this is two extra pawns, and that's just too much. Slowly but surely, those two extra pawns shows. And as Benko brings up his king, yes, that's very good to remember, and it's important even in queen endgames. Although sometimes you need to hide with your king, this is just winning for him. Notice this nice little trick, queen g7. Korchnoi can't take on f5 because queen g6, and the h-pawn is just going to promote. So he doesn't take queen d8, f6, and black resigned for a good reason, because that f-pawn is going to promote, just like the h-pawn would have. All right, so let's take a look at this other game played between Byrne and Benko. So Benko is black, and here black finds this very good defensive move of rook a7. The idea being, if knight takes a5, I go bishop d8. And then this will be some nasty threats on your pinned knight. Therefore, Byrne plays c4, knight d4, knight d6, check, knight takes e5, knight c8, rook c7, and we get into this endgame. Now, white has very decent chances of drawing here, but we'll see how Benko slowly tries to outplay Robert Byrne. Rook c5, knight b6. So first things first, he's bringing his knight to d5, bishop c3, but he doesn't blunder mate. King h7, rook c6, knight d5, and we'll have to find a good way to open up the position for black. How can black try to gain some more space for his position? f6, c5, or g5. And he actually goes for g5. Takes. And even though black is not happy about exchanging, it was kind of forced because black will need the king to probe for a win. King g2, g4. Again, trying to just put white in some sort of bind. f3. Again, white is trying to exchange as many pieces as possible. Rook b7, bishop d4, rook b3, king g6, rook c4, king f5. Notice, in many of these endgames, the best of the best players just bring their kings up the board because they know that it will be very useful in the long run. Bishop g7, f6, also a good move. Just cutting this bishop on g7 out of play. Bishop h6, knight c3, rook f4, knight e4. Obviously, Benko doesn't want to take on f3 because then white would have realistic chances of getting a drawn endgame by exchanging this pawn off and sacrificing the bishop for one of these pawns. So let's say if rook f3 takes, just posting the bishop on g7, and white has good chances of drawing this. So Benko goes for check, rook h2, and notice that he's not doing big things, he's just trying to minimize the activity of the white pieces, like the king on f1, bishop e3, knight d2, and he decides that it's time for a rook endgame. Rook h3, king f5, e5, rook g3, rook a2. Now he plays rook a2 to be far away from this king, and potentially checks are much better that way, because if I check you now, I can attack you with a tempi, I'm already hitting you, and then I'll just go back to f2 when the time is right. Rook a2, rook c6, king g5. So let's look at this position for a moment. What should be black's plan here? Well, yeah, it involves some king move activity, but what about our precious little pawns on f6 and e5? Where should we position our pawns? That's actually the big question. f5, e4 will be the best one, and that's what Benko is aiming for, king g6, but he's patient. He slowly tries to kick this rook out. Rook e8. Byrne correctly keeps this rook under the pawn. Also planning ideas of rook g8 check if necessary. King f5, rook f8, rook a6. Now, sooner or later, black wants to move these pawns. Therefore, we need to move the rook. King g2, king e4. Maybe hinting at ideas at f5 and checking and going to king f3 if the rook moves. So it could be a ghost threat, but it's kind of annoying to face in a real game. King e4, king f2, check, king f5. Again, it's a similar position that we've seen, but it's not quite the same, so white needs to work on how to defend. Rook f7, king e6. Already an achievement for Benko, as now he will be able to push his pawns. f5. Now, this is already a clear achievement. This g-pawn will stay there, because if white moves it, then I'll have two passed pawns, and that's a realistic winning chance for black. Checks. Rook f8 check, king g6, check, king h5. Kind of dissuading white from giving more checks, because if you do, I'll go king g4, you check again, king f3, and now with an active passer like that e-pawn and an active king on f3, this is very, very good for black. Obviously, Byrne doesn't want any of that, so he doesn't give a check. Just plays rook e8, e4, and rook g8, stopping the king from entering through g4. Rook c2, king e1, rook c6. So the plan is to get rid of that rook somehow. King f2, rook g6, rook h8, king g5, rook f8. But it's still not easy, because we'll have to find a plan for black. In general, our plan would be to bring the king to f3. But let's see how Benko achieves that. King g4, f2, rook g8. F6, king g5. Notice that he's kind of inviting Byrne to give him a tempi, and he accepts that extra tempi that he gets. Plays king g5, so Byrne actually has to move his rook first. Rook f7, rook d8. Again, the king came much closer to where it wants to be, and now he goes back to d8 with the rook. rook g7 check. And in fact, rook g7 check might have been a mistake. Black wants to get rid of the ideas of rook g7 checks. White should have tried to wait, because if you go further, then I'll check you and play rook g5, and I'll have counter-attacking ideas. And white has good chances to hold. So Byrne should have waited in this position, but instead he played rook g7. So where should we go now with our king? That's the big question here. Well, yeah. Well, let's just make one move of king f6. Obviously, we're getting closer. Now we give a check. And the problem here is that the rook is not defending this pawn anymore. And that was actually the main point of Benko's maneuvering, that this rook after this hasty check, it's not possible anymore to defend that pawn. White doesn't really like going back to the first rank. He'd like to go e3, but that just is not too great because of rook g2. If you come here, I'll check you, and I'll win the pawn. So therefore, Byrne is forced to go f1. King e5. Now, as pointed out, king d4 is a real threat. Rook a5, rook d5, rook a5, rook d1 check, king e2, rook d3, checks again, king f2, check. Again, the problem, g3 pawn not defended, has to go back to the first rank. Rook g2 now, and now this is winning because of the fact that the black king can march to g5, g4, which was previously not possible. And even though the king can chase this rook away, that's not enough anymore. So rook b2 comes, and the king will come up to g4, and black will slowly gobble up the pawn. Therefore, Byrne resigned. All right. So we saw how Benko usually plays. He plays for binds and these classical ways of trying to grind away and slowly getting an advantage. So last but not least, let's look at the game played against Robert James Fischer. Now, they have a big history together. In fact, Benko Paul withdrew of one of the candidates tournament just like Lombardi, and that gave Robert James Fischer the chance to play in the 1970 candidates tournament, which he won and qualified for that world championship. And we know the history. Fischer became a world champion. So in this game, Benko plays the Benko opening with 1g3. And if you think this is not too popular these days, even though by transposition in this tournament played recently in St. Louis, Aronian played a very similar g3 system against Kasparov at the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz. Go check that out. It's very similar. g3, knight f6, bishop g2, g6. Well, Fischer plays his regular King's Indian Grunfeld kind of play. So he goes g6. Other more Slav-like players would go d5. But Fischer keeps playing what he likes and goes for this King's Indian structure. e4, d6, d4, bishop g7, knight e2. Now this is Benko's way of handling the position. It's also possible to play knight c3, castles, knight f3, and this is what you will see in the game between Aronian and Kasparov, played recently. Now he goes knight e2, and what really Benko is looking for, he states that this knight will be more useful here. I will have ideas of pushing the pawn later on. Also, I will be able to build a bind against you. And he's going to try to prove that against Fischer. Castle, castle, e5, knight c3. c4 would just transpose to King's Indian waters, as we all know that. Knight c3, c6, a4, knight d7. And if we know Benko's style, we'll guess his next move. What would Benko play in this type of position?
A5.
A5, yes. Benko loves playing for positional bind, and he will show it in this game as well. He takes d4. Well, Fischer is an active player. He loves playing for counterplay. Therefore, he opens up the position a little bit just to get a nice little knight on c5 and also get some counterplay against this e4 pawn, which is attacked by both pieces. h3. Now, as we've seen previously, h3 moves are very useful as they work against these knight g4 jumps. So rook e8, rook e1, knight d7, this typical plan of bringing over the knight to e5. But the big difference is, compared to King's Indian structures, the c2 pawn covers this d3 square and also the b3 square. Known from these Bronstein games, we know how useful it is to have protection over that squares on d3 and b3. So knight d7, bishop e3, queen c7, f4. Already, Benko is preparing a potential idea of facing d5 ideas with e5. Obviously, he can take, but in case, if everything goes wrong, he can just play e5 and just close off this g7 bishop. Rook b8, queen d2, b5. Now, computers would consider ideas like b4 immediately or e5. And it's not that these moves are bad or anything. They are legitimate moves in this position. But Benko is consistent with his plan. So he takes on b6, and finds an idea that will put a lot of pressure in Black's position. What did Benko play in this position?
B4, B5.
b4, b5. Yes, b4. A very strong idea by White, as he's making sure that the d5 square will be eternally his. Knight e6 and b5 comes. The big problem here is that you have no good ways of defending this c-pawn. And if this c-pawn disappears, this d5 square will be an eternal weakness. Takes, c5. And Benko realizes he has a firm positional advantage. So I guess on principle, he doesn't get into tactical struggles, because why do that if you have a good position? He plays queen d2, bishop b7, rook d1, rook e6. And here, Benko found that this is the right moment to just break through. How did Benko broke through in this position? Just marched through with e5, yes. And now this is very tough to face, as d takes e5 is not an option, because I'll just take your knight on d7. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, queen b7 check. And we'll have to decide where to put our king. There's the choice of king h2 and king f2. Let me ask, raise your hand if you feel that you would put your king on f2. 1, 2, 3. Okay, who would say that you would put your king on h2? That's very interesting. Benko indeed played king f2. And what's really good about this move, king f2, Benko realized, I assume, that he's not in a big danger of getting into any tactical ideas. But we only have these pieces, rooks and queens on the board, these heavy pieces on the board. So we're not far off having an endgame. So having your king closer, in that case, is a plus. King h2 is also an option and is pretty good too, but wouldn't have the extra pluses of the move king f2. Rook d8, e takes d6, knight f6. Well, we are a pawn up, therefore exchanging is a good option. Queen e3, king f7. How could we continue if exchanging is not among the evils? Queen f3. We are happy to have an endgame, but of course Fischer doesn't want any of that. Now Benko comes up with another very nice technical move. Obviously d6 pawn is hanging, but Benko finds a very, very classy idea in this position. Queen c6 is obviously an option, but is that the only way to defend that d6 pawn? Just a hint that Benko, even though likes to play for a bind, if he sees tactics, he uses it to maximum extent. And he uses it to get a huge grip on the position. And that's just what happened here as well. So the move is knight e4. Takes. The question is, what Benko was preparing if rook takes d6 was played by Bobby Fischer? That's little cheeky move of queen e5. As the queen on b8 is an x-ray, and that would be in a slight trouble. Now we'd say that, oh, rook d8, but Benko thought about this as well. Rook d7 check. And black is just lost. If you go e8, I just take on e6. If you go f8, I just checkmate you. So this is a very, very nice tactic that Benko found, and now his position is just winning. Queen c6, now he plays queen c6 after exchanging of those pieces. King f3, just defending the pawns, also moving the king into safety. King g7, g4, e5. Benko is not afraid of ghosts. He takes that pawn. Rook f7. And not everyone plays like Tal. He went king g2. He went king g2 because this is safest. Obviously, Tal would go king e4, king d5 and be happy. But that's a different story, and that's Tal. But Benko realizes he's winning, so why go crazy and do aggressive stuff like that? King g2, queen h4, rook f1. And after takes, queen takes h3, queen g2, queen e3, queen e2. Bobby Fischer resigned. As if black plays this check, and he did, white will eventually just hide with his king. And then these pawns on e5 and d6 will decide the game. So this was a game played by the legendary Pal Benko, who's going to be 90 in July. So I hope that you learn how to play like a pro, like Benko Pal.